whatever it takes to retain power.
Trump is an autocrat, and when an autocrat tells you what he is and what he's going to do, we should believe him. Good afternoon. Welcome to another episode of The Count, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin-Almanza, and this is my co-host, as always, Alana Sibben. It's Wednesday, October 21st. We are now less than 2 weeks away. We are 13 days away from Election Day. But of course, Election Day is not in any way the day of the election this year. Election Day is just the last day of voting. Voting has already started. The election is already happening. It's in full swing. More than 40 million American ballots have already been cast. Now, that means that 30% of the 2016 vote total already been cast in just a little over a week of early voting. Texas and Vermont have crossed the 50% threshold, meaning that they've already hit 50% of their 2016 total votes. And so this is technically a show about the election, but really this is about much more than just Election Day or the last day of voting or that process. This is a show about all of the ways in which someone interested in retaining power, aspiring towards autocracy, could try to seize that election and undermine our democracy and take advantage of our systems in a way to secure 4 more years of minority rule.
And if you joined us yesterday, you saw us talk with Ben Sheehan, who took us on a narrative of history where he talked to us about the election of 1876, which gave us some insight about what could happen in a contested election today. And today what we're going to do is take a much shorter trip through history to the 2000 presidential election between George W. Bush and Al Gore. And with us today to help us on that journey is Jay Willis, a senior contributor to The Appeal, a co-host of Emily's other show, The Briefing, and an expert on all things courts, judges, laws, elections. He also likes to, I'm not sure why, watch Fox News. Jay, thanks for joining us again and giving us that insight.
Jay, you're muted, but it's okay because I'm going to introduce you even further. So you have time to sort out the mute button. You recently wrote this story in The Appeal called "Election Night Coverage is Broken. In 2020, it could be dangerous." 2020 is just the year that turns all broken things dangerous, really. But in this piece, you shared some words of caution for the media, urging news outlets this year, above all other years, to treat election night as something other than, you said, not to treat election night as a televised coronation ceremony, which is, of course, what they've done for decades now. And you described a scene from election night in 2000 where CBS News anchor Dan Rather joined other outlets in declaring Bush the winner, which was, of course, just hours after they had initially called a tight race in Florida for Al Gore, which was, of course, totally divorced from the realities of vote counting, as we later found out. But we'd like to play that clip now and then come back to you for some commentary.
Hell yeah, let's do this pain together.
Bush wins. Florida goes Bush. The presidency is Bush. That's it. CBS News estimates when all the votes are in and counted that George Bush will have won the presidency of the United States. Let's pause for a second. Let that sink in. Bush wins. If our CBS News estimates are correct up and down the line tonight, and we believe they are, George Bush, George W. Bush, son of President George Bush, revenge is his and revenge is sweet. As in Austin, they begin celebrating.
Okay. So I hate this video. I hate it for a lot of reasons, and more importantly, the reasons why Jay hates it. But just to kick off, it's as we all know, nobody could have predicted the vote totals in Florida. It was one of the most contested, if not the most contested, vote counting in American history. Putting this in the context of like the vengeance of the son of a prior king is just like very weird. It's a weird choice from Dan Rather, weird tone from Dan Rather, weird like drumming of certainty. And as you note in your piece, this image of Bush, this grinning Bush, would actually have a lasting impact on the ensuing battle to decide the presidency. So can you take us through the significance of that call and what it revealed about the power of media to shape the narrative and affect public opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. Like right as soon as we finished dunking on Dan Rather a little bit more, if you extend that clip out like another 20 seconds, there's like this big pause as the camera sweeps over the Bush victory party and people are going nuts. And you can hear Dan Rather really wind up for it. And he goes, "The sun also rises."
Oh, no.
It's so good. Like he went full Ernest Hemingway and just like, I want to know so much more. I want to know like how he workshopped that, what his other lines were, like what his gore lines were. Like I love it so much in the sense that like I say that to distance myself from the like pain and horror that it wrought. But yeah, to your point, like that moment of calling the election for Bush, it really mattered. Rather's, and you know, we shouldn't call out just Rather here. I believe every network but the Associated Press had called the election for Bush. His tone and rhetoric, to your point, is just particularly over the top. Again, if you extend that clip out a little more, he says, "It isn't over till it's over, but it's over, and Bush wins it," which is just not the case. Well, Bush did win it, but it was not, in fact, over. In that moment, he got all of the tropes that we typically associate with an election winner. He got the portrait on screen. Across every TV screen in America was the flag, the White House, the presidential seal, the declaration of him as the 43rd president. It really takes hold in your mind. And for a lot of Americans, that was hard to shake. And we can see that in polling numbers. So 2 weeks after Election Day, as the recount is dragging on and it's working its way through the court system, primarily in Florida, Gallup found that 27% of voters said they approved of the conduct of Gore, but not Bush. 35% of voters said they approved of Bush, but not Gore. This election was statistically about as close to a tie as it gets. Voters nationwide cast about 500,000 more votes for Gore than for Bush. But just 2 weeks later, that people were ready for this to be over. This mattered in the court of public opinion. A Bush victory felt like affirming what they saw on TV, and a Gore victory felt like overturning it.
You know, it sort of makes us think about the obligation of the media. And here they really did not meet their obligation and instead sort of created their own narrative that ended up changing how the country thought about this election or that election. Which has me thinking about this election and sort of the obligation that the media has in the election that's coming up in only a few weeks. And so we've spoken multiple times on the show how we can't refer to this election or treat this election like the Super Bowl. We can't treat election night like it's this big event with watch parties and all of the alcohol and the gatherings and all that sort of thing. This year is different. It's 2020. The pandemic has created massive mail-in voting and absentee voting. And so it's really unlikely that we're going to know who won on election night. And you wrote about this in your article where you said that covering this election will not be like covering a Super Bowl. It will be more like covering the first day of the Tour de France. Can you talk us through the new timeline that we might see this year and explain how a more responsible media might approach this election?
Yeah, it bears repeating at the jump because of what we know about mail-in ballots and absentee ballots tending to favor Democrats. We've seen that in election after election. This is less likely to matter if Biden is miles ahead on election night, right? But if it's not, if it's close, if it looks like Trump is in the lead, and I'll return to that language a little bit, yeah, the media's got to treat this differently. The Tour de France, I never know. It proceeds over days, right? Over stages. Winning one day's stage doesn't mean that you win the race. It also doesn't even necessarily mean that you're in the lead. It just means that you finished first in this particular sort of arbitrary segment of the race. So saying that Trump is leading, for example, I think this language is going to be really hard for the media to figure out. And candidly, I don't have the perfect answer off the top of my head, but it's something that they've got to think about. So saying that Trump is leading, what does that really mean? It's not necessarily that he's winning the election. All the ballots have been cast already. It just means that he has more of the votes that happen to have been counted. Think too about what happens if Biden receives more of the absentee ballots, like, again, we think he would. In sports, we might say, oh, Biden's making a comeback, right? But Biden's not coming back. Again, those votes were already cast. We're just talking about the process of tallying up votes. So to like torture an analogy a little bit, if I give you a jar of 200 M&Ms and I'm like, we got to figure out how many green ones are in here, and you start taking them out and counting them, you're not going to say that green is in the lead just because like 4 of the first 10 come out that way. Or if you do, you say so with the implicit understanding that it doesn't necessarily mean anything about the final results. And if at the end of this exercise, it turns out that the color that there's the most of is the red ones, you wouldn't really say, wow, red made a dramatic comeback. You just recognize that there were more red ones in there all along. Talking about a Biden comeback, I think, is really going to fuel this perception that these later counted ballots are fraudulent or illegitimate. Again, it's a really hard job for the media to describe the process of administrators tallying votes while making clear that there's nothing unique or nefarious about these votes. It's just the process of counting them up.
I don't think it's that hard. You just did it. The M&M analogy is great. I feel like you could just give a masterclass. We'll email this video to a lot of people in the national news media and be like, it's counting M&Ms. It is not the Tour de France. I'm a little disappointed you didn't make it the group round of the World Cup, because that would have really spoken to me more, and I think is more likable than Tour de France.
CNN producers, I'm available. My DMs are open.
He will bring a jar of M&Ms.
This on screen. So, all right. So taking all of this into account, I think we have to go back though to like, we are all so eager to attribute noble ideals to our journalists, whom we love. However, like, we have to be real that over-the-top election night coverage has only gotten more over the top in the 2 decades since that 2000 election, with like holograms and computer boards, and it's gotten more Super Bowl-like.
The hologram rules, hell yeah.
And maybe they need a hologram of a giant jar of M&Ms. But it's really worrying, because in this particular election, I think one of the factors that we have to consider is that one of the candidates is a very traditional elected official type, and the other candidate is a former or current, really, reality TV star who is obsessed by ratings and viewership and drama and twists and those sorts of things, who plays very well in that sandbox, which is not the sandbox we necessarily want being our government, but it is the sandbox that this media has sort of ventured toward in recent coverage. And as we've said on this show, and we'll repeat in this piece, Trump is really trying to frame election night as the series finale. Can you walk us through a scenario of how that could play out in a really dangerous way if the media, in pursuit of ratings, were to like buy into the season finale idea?
Yeah, and I think we got a preview of this in 2018 when the Florida gubernatorial and Senate elections went to automatic recounts. And Trump's take on this was literally must go with election night. Like all the absentee ballots, he didn't want those counted because he didn't want to take the risk that his preferred candidates might end up losing. And like, if he was going to go to the mat for Rick Scott and like Ron DeSantis, like it stands to reason he'll go way further when he thinks it's his own electoral
For
future.
himself, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the more decisively Trump appears to be ahead on election night or at any point in the counting process, the more rhetorical appeal this sort of conspiracy theory about a rigged election will carry. And again, when I say the more he appears to be ahead, who are we talking about? That's the responsibility of the media. In terms of the consequences, like this is a president who plays footsie with right-wing malicious psychos and openly calls on his supporters to intimidate voters at the polls. It's really not hard to imagine like a cable news graphic or clip that shows a state or states that are red on election night and then flip blue a couple days later. Like, I don't mean this metaphorically. Trump indignantly tweeting a clip like that is the kind of thing that can get people killed in this environment. And I think the media has to really think about the danger of sort of relying on their traditional tropes here.
I want to ask a really quick follow-up about that, because I think that when we talk about the media, we're talking about a really broad ideological range, right? Not just very center of the road media, but also we've got Fox News. Some people would say that on the other side, you have MSNBC. And I'm wondering if you can kind of project what the risk is of something like Fox News going rogue and going along with a Trump tweet of victory in a way that other networks might not.
Yeah, I don't know. It's really complicated, just like, that's sort of an evergreen answer to every question we talk about on this show. So the LA Times has done some especially great reporting on this on the Fox News election analysis team as ostensibly separate from the Hannitys and Carlsons and Ingrams of the network. The head of that team, Aaron Mishkin, he kind of famously went on the air in 2012 to fight with Karl Rove after Karl Rove disputed Fox News calling Ohio for Obama. So there is some precedent there for Fox News's election analysis team being pretty good. But like two follow-ups there. One, even if you assume that's true, and if they won't get pressure from the network to do something, there's nothing standing in the way of Hannity and Carlson and Ingram going on the air the next day and talking about the election as a done deal and absentee ballots as fraudulent. Like, for all the eyes that's going to be on the election night straight news coverage, the Fox News's weeknight primetime lineup is really sort of the injected into your veins of the MAGA sphere. And then secondly, to your point more generally, outside the Fox News bubble at any network, journalists are competitive. Everyone is going to want to be the first one to project the election. It's going to be a big deal, and there's going to be pressure on them to, at some point, make the call. There's so much that we don't know, but the bottom line is that what's been enough to call an election in previous years is probably not going to be enough this year.
Well, thank you for scaring us again, Jay.
What I do here.
Thank you. Yes. And, we here at The Count have been sort of shouting these warnings to anybody who will listen. But I mean, if we're being honest, we are two women who are speaking to people in front of green screens. I am literally talking from my closet right now. So as much as we hope that people will listen to our message, it really is up to all of these networks that you just talked about to do the right thing and to be responsible about reporting this election. So I'm wondering, have you seen any signs that networks are going to do the right thing? And what are your sort of takes on that?
Yeah, the media knows that this year is going to be different. And like, to be fair, they know they screwed up in 2000. So there was an independent report commissioned by CNN to sort of do a post-mortem of their coverage. And this report characterized it as a, quote, news disaster, which is, sucks to read that once you paid for it. Blaming the network's early calls for treating Bush's victory as sort of a done deal and portraying Gore as a challenger and a sore loser for trying to steal the election when really he was just trying to find out who actually won it. So networks are making changes this year. You've seen some reporting about networks beefing up their analyst teams and really talking about pushing coverage that is slow, steady, and fact-based. But again, I think this urge to be the first one to send out that push alert is always going to butt up against the desire to be right. And again, just as a recent example, in 2018, when early on election night, it didn't look like Democrats were going to have quite the blue wave they had hoped for. Van Jones went on the air to CNN, and he called the results heartbreaking for Democrats. In the days that followed, as we actually totaled up votes, it turned out to be the Democrats' biggest wave election in 40 years. And I get this, like, putting up the too close to call graphic is really unsatisfying, right? Like, it's not fun for a news anchor who wants to make history to vamp and then eventually sign off at like 3 a.m. with no resolution. But it's just too dangerous to take risks this year. The more willing journalists are to stay out of the way in 2020, the likelier it is that like some semblance of democracy is going to survive it.
So, okay, I want to drill in. I understand Van Jones's reaction. It is really hard to be asked to like show up on election night, talk about what's going on, and not draw conclusions. That is super hard. And I think we're living in an ecosystem right now where, yes, the national news media is important, but we in our closets are also talking about this in front of thousands of people on the internet. And you, the thousands of people on the internet, are also talking about this on social media and with your friends and family and on Twitter. Jay, what advice would you have for folks who are going to be experiencing election night, maybe talking with friends and family about it, maybe talking with more people about it, maybe going on, I don't know, a show or something? What advice would you give them about how to analyze without drawing unhelpful conclusions?
And to add on to that, should folks be canceling their election parties or only focusing on other races on election day?
Yeah, you talked about canceling election parties earlier, and like there will be as much alcohol in my house for this election as there normally is. Like that's not something that I'll personally be changing. I guess to each their own. In terms of advice, like honestly, probably the best thing you could do for your mental health is not stay up and watch the election results until 2 or 3 in the morning or whatever. Just like leave that New York Times, that like nightmare ticker thing alone. It's not going to make the results come any faster. It's certainly not going to make the results come that night. But to the extent, you know, that there are media, like you can't control what the media reports, right? Like the media is going to say something about the election. And if what they say is, in your view, knowing all of this, too strong of a conclusion to draw, you just can't let that get in your head. Certainly don't spend all of your time on Twitter, like, you know, yelling at Tucker Carlson to stop taking his victory lap, right? Let the process play out and don't get caught up too much in the media's need, their business need to have something to talk about to make some kind of story out of it.
Oh, Jay, I noticed you mentioned the amount of alcohol in your house, but no house guests or people coming over for the party. So if we have an election night party here, I'm sure you will be invited to our Zoom.
Thank God.
Otherwise, it's just you and all that liquor.
Can't wait.
Jay, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a joy, and we look forward to having you again soon.
Thanks so much.
So speaking of election night parties, in the time of COVID, I think many of you out there may be joining or following Jay's example and just like stocking up on supplies, but not having people over because it's unsafe and it's winter and it's hard to do stuff outside if you don't live in Florida. And there may be just an anticlimax on the news. We hope there is. We hope there is a responsible anticlimax, but we will be here. I think we will be here on election night. We're going to have details coming in coming shows. So you should keep tuning in to find out more about what we are going to be doing to help everyone stay reasonable on election night. So Alana, I think we have some reason to not be like super pessimistic. I'm thinking specifically of that clip we played last week of Jake Tapper, who's from CNN, of course, telling people about the need to treat this like a marathon, not a sprint. And I think Jake Tapper also tweeted like a couple days ago that election day is just the last day of voting. It is not the day the election is over. The election will be ongoing. So I think we're definitely seeing awareness. And as Jay pointed out, you know, the news media has done self-analysis, somewhat rough, difficult self-analysis to try and do better and cover this more responsibly. But there is still a motive. There's still the sort of business demand that he mentioned to come up with something to say, something exciting that keeps people watching on election night. But do you see any other signs of like promising framing out there?
Sure. I mean, I see, you know, for example, I was even watching Chris Hayes last night and he called election day the last day of voting. And he was very intentional about doing that in order to say, hey, it's just the last day of voting and it's going to take a long time, therefore, to be able to count all the votes that go along with that. So that gives me a little bit of hope. But I want to go back to what he said about the business motive. I think it's a business motive, but I also think it's this motive to satisfy folks who are exhausted. I mean, I've talked to people who have said, oh my goodness, I can't wait till election night. I just can't wait for to have some finality, to have this be over. And the response is, well, you're not going to have finality on election night. But I get it. We've had a rough past 4 years, especially this election cycle. especially with the pandemic happening. People are looking to have their need to have a new president or know who the new president is satisfied. And so that business need to call the winner is also to satisfy this need that viewers have to have some closure in this process. And so it's going to be really difficult for the media to be able to say, listen, we know you want the finality, but you're not going to get it tonight. And I do have some hope that they'll be able to do that, but it's not going to be easy.
Yeah, I was listening to NPR the other day, and they were doing a panel of voters from across the political spectrum. And there were all of these voters sort of expressing this theme. All of them, no matter who they were voting for, Trump, Biden, they were all saying, most Americans are not like our government. We are not as polarized as our government is. Most people, like I think there was a Trump voter who mentioned that her Biden voting neighbors had brought her a pasta salad the night before. Because most people actually want to retain our interpersonal relationships. And I think the psychological fatigue you're talking about, I really do link that back to the Trump administration in particular. People are always eager for an election outcome because we all get sick of election season. It's like the Christmas season that starts way too early. Like we are all no longer in the mood by the time the actual day arrives. But now we've been through 4 years of a government that has been historically just like outrageous and unhinged and doing things that are illegal, and like just the drama level that everyone has had to sustain for 4 years is not sustainable for the human psyche. And I don't think it's an accident. I really do think that there is a deliberate autocratic desire to exhaust people into complacency or into just checking out.
Yeah, I definitely see that there's a huge desire not only to have some finality, but just like you're saying, to sort of have this world of civility. I mean, for example, we've seen that viewing of the West Wing has gone up in the past 4 years because people want that world where there are policy differences, but it's not a difference of, hey, do you believe in democracy, period. But I think exactly what you're saying too, the intentional goal of an autocrat to create chaos is really important to talk about, because it will potentially, if people don't do the right thing here, result in people accepting Donald Trump trying to make many votes not be counted.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of like this big cycle with that the media has a role to play, the people of America have a role to play, and we know that Donald Trump has been playing his role, and people need to make sure that they're not complacent in that.
I would like less role playing and more Rob Lowe obsessing over whether we should even have pennies. But anyway,
I love that episode.
Was that a great episode?
It was great.
All right. So speaking of what people think and how exhausted people are and how ready people are to engage with at least a week, if not a month, of vote counting, Alana, it's poll time.
Poll time!
Oh, I'm disappearing into the Zoom.
I know, my shirt turned white. It was kind of cool.
All right. So we have a slate of new results today that are, I think, really interesting. They underscore some of the lessons that Jay just gave us about the need for additional education, about the specific contours of the 2020 election that are different from any election before it, both for and by the media. Now, in past editions of Poll Time, we've gotten valuable insight into how voters might respond to various election night scenarios.
And we know, for example, that Republican voters are likely to trust Trump if he declares himself the winner on the election night, especially if Fox News makes that same call. And past polling has shown us that voters believe that they would, or believed rather, that they would definitely know who won the presidential race on election night. But then we saw, as voters were given more information, their views started to change, which is a good thing. And especially when they learned about how long it would take to count mail-in voting and about previous elections that took longer to call due to the counting process.
Yeah. So today, new polling from Data for Progress and the Justice Collaborative Institute shows that while fewer voters are expecting the instant gratification of knowing the winner on election night, many are still not prepared for the sort of long drawn out process that is the most likely outcome. That's the process that would be required to fairly and carefully count everybody's votes. So here to talk with us again today is Jason Gans, Chief of Staff of Data for Progress. Jason, welcome back.
Jason, you're back. We
Emily, great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Jason, great to see you again. We missed you. We had to do poll time by ourselves yesterday,
Disgrace. It was just a disgrace.
I don't know why we even try. It was not as good. So we're really glad you're here to put us to shame. So I found this polling interesting because it built off some of the previous results we've discussed with you on this show, but it also managed to give us a little bit more information and gave us some insights that on one hand were really promising, but on the other hand were a bit concerning. So this survey provided respondents with some background information about mail-in voting and the speed of the vote count in battleground states. Then it asked a series of questions about people's expectations for when they would know the winner of the election. So let's start by putting up the results to the initial question about whether voters thought they'd get results on election night. Let's pull that up right now. So Jason, talk us through this.
Yeah, so what we're seeing here is a encouraging trend where we're seeing over half of voters are now recognizing the truth that they should be not very confident that they would receive a winner on election night. And these numbers are actually pretty good. They're trending in the right direction. We're seeing a majority of people now not being sure that they'll see it. And the interesting thing here is that Republicans are still the most confident that they will receive it on election night, but a good amount of Republicans are starting to recognize that they won't. And most significantly, independents are really recognizing that election night is going to be a long, drawn-out process. Independents in general tend to be a little bit more unsure about things in the political arena, so it makes sense that they have lower confidence here. And overall, we're starting to see that some of the efforts at voter education around how long this can take due to vote by mail or other factors in the vote counting might make it so that the election night is not the final day of the 2020 election process.
So in subsequent questions, you kind of expanded the time frame for people. You asked respondents whether they believed they'd know the winner a few days after Election Day or within a week after Election Day or more than a week after Election Day. And it looked like confidence in getting those results increased in the first two periods, but ultimately declined a little bit once we got to that last category of more than a week after Election Day. So let's put up the image. And Jason, what's going on here?
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing here is that overall voters are, more confident that as time goes on, they will be they'll be getting the results of the election. So this tracks with what we would, actually expect to see in real life. If there is a contested election, then, within a few days, maybe within a week or two, more likely, and then after that, most likely. And so we see the thing here is a very confident number. And so you can see that very confident number consistently going up as you extend out the length of period that you're looking at, which tracks to the percentage of people that overall it's going to go up. It makes sense. We think that over time, it's more likely who wins, unless, of course, there are some shenanigans that happen, and then all bets are off.
So on one hand, it's good that people are getting a little more realistic about what they can expect on election night. But on the other, a solid majority of voters, it looks like, think that they'll get the answer within a week. And in fact, we saw that confidence dropped when asked about the more than a week time frame, meaning that people seem to find that scenario unlikely. And we all know that the reality of the matter is that it might take a lot longer than a week. So what do you make of these results, Jason?
Yeah, it's certainly true that the electoral outcome we are least prepared for, and the one that's kind of the most scary, is the long drawn out battle where this goes through a lengthy court battle. I mean, the nightmare is essentially a Florida 2000 2.0, where this works its way up through the courts, it works its way through the Supreme Court. And because, like you guys were saying before, people are so fatigued with all this, because COVID makes it harder to focus because everyone's just trying to get through their days, then we're not able to give this the kind of sustained attention and scrutiny. So certainly the scenario where it takes longer than a week, there's a long drawn out battle, that is when we start to really get into the danger zone. And it's very important that all of the movements, all of the people on the ground are working together to deliver loud and clear the message that we do need to count every vote. We cannot let them steal this election through the courts. We cannot let them steal this election through the legislatures. And no matter what happens, no matter how much they want to just call a wrap on it, they would say, as I say, they want to put a lid on it. We just can't let them do that. We got to make sure that they count every vote. And I think that what this is showing is that voters are a little hazy about the kind of long-term scenarios. And that's why it's important that everyone in the media, everyone through our movement organizations are spreading the message that it is a possibility. It's not the most likely possibility, but it is a possibility, and a very important one that we need to be aware of and people need to be prepped for.
So Jason, I mean, I think what I hear you describing is a tension between how long it takes to count tens of millions of votes and how long people want to pay attention to a show. And if we're letting people's interest in and attention to a TV show govern, then you're right, there's this desire to put a lid on it. But that's not going to work in a situation where we need to carefully count tens of millions of ballots. So we asked this question in the previous segment. I'm going to ask the same question of you. How do we manage those expectations? What role do our leaders play, the media play? How do we all prepare people to get past their own attention span and let the votes be counted?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a really difficult one because it ties into so many of the incentives particularly in the media, with social media. You're going to see people wanting to call it. And like, we talk about what happens, if Trump or Biden calls it, but what's going to happen when, like MAGA Dude 77 calls it and then it gets 100,000 retweets? The instant gratification that social media and the way information spreads like rapid fire is going to make it almost impossible to prevent people from making calls, people from disputing, from there being just a general haze, a disinformation fugue surrounding this. And so that makes it all the more incumbent. We've been talking about these alternate realities that Trump supporters and the Republicans live in. And it's incumbent on all of us not to allow those people who, again, we keep seeing, it's 30-ish% of the population are the ones that are really like fully outside the realm of reality. And we cannot allow those 30% of people to project their reality on top of us, because they may be wrong, but they're going to be loud and wrong. And so we need to be loud and right to combat them.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. Do not let @MAGADude77 draw you into his fugue, his disinformation fugue. I'm just in love with Jason's language for the last several sentences.
Can you tell we missed you? Can you tell?
It's great to do that.
We will not be drawn into the disinformation fugue. And we can't let people be loud and wrong on the internet any more than we let them be loud and wrong at the next table in a restaurant. So, Jason,
exactly.
So much for joining us. Yesterday was awful without you. We will see you again and again and again this week. So really appreciate you joining us.
Awesome. Looking forward to it.
Take care.
Goodbye.
Yeah. So Alana, when I reflect on the question that I just asked, Jay, and then I just asked Jason, the question to me comes down to, how do you hold people's attention with the equivalent of watching paint dry? Because the sheer volume of people in this country and votes that need to be counted, the sheer volume of counting that needs to happen is astonishing. People have a really hard time conceiving of big numbers. Like it's really easy it's easy to think of 3 people, and it's really hard to understand 200,000 people. Or at least to understand them as individual humans with individual lives and needs and votes that need to be counted. So I keep trying to think about strategies to engage people throughout a bitter legal battle over how votes should be counted. Republican attempts to discount ballots for bureaucratic reasons, for not, being folded right or using the wrong pen. And doing that in an environment where people are understandably frustrated and disappointed and don't want to wait, and where you have the psychological warfare of the president basically conveying, this will all be over if you just let me win. I mean, it's an almost untangleable knot that I think is going to require some really creative visual aids, investigations, outside the box thinking, and really like explain it like I'm 5 coverage from news networks.
Yeah, I think also news outlets should rethink the dates that are big dates for them. Maybe November 3rd isn't the big date in this election. Maybe news anchors should say, hey, let's have a big night on December 8th and a number.
Safe harbor date. Wait, let's go over that one more time. Let's explain why you said December 8th.
Well, and also December 14th. But December 8th, the safe harbor date, meaning the date that all the votes have to be counted and all the disputes have to be settled, and then have another big night on December 14th where the votes are cast in the Electoral College. And honestly, if it isn't resolved by then, have another big date on January 20th. Well, there's always a big date on January 20th, but change what it means about how coverage happens on those dates. And that's going to be really important because we've already seen a preview of what Donald Trump is going to do when these dates go on, when there's an extended process. I mean, for example, yesterday I talked about that race in New York where they didn't decide that election, or they didn't have that election decided until over a month after election day or primary day. And that was normal. They were working out all of the kinks. They were resolving the disputes, and all of these things are going to happen. And so media outlets need to be really responsible about changing the norms of how elections are normally run. And who knows, maybe even use it as an opportunity. This is an opportunity to educate the public and to have some more exciting dates on your, holographic Super Bowl day. And have, Will.i.am come again to CNN like he did with Anderson Cooper.
I think Will.i.am can show up holographically any day he wants. But no, I want to go over this one more time because I have no guarantee that the people watching this episode actually watched our earlier episode, which I believe it was episode 2 or 3, where we really broke down the process here. So here's what I want to break down. If you are a person who needs to have an end date, just psychologically, and you're like, I had November 3rd in my calendar, and Emily, if you take that away from me, I will break. If you are that person, please circle December 8th in your calendar with a big red marker. Because no matter what Donald Trump says from November 3rd to December 8th, December 8th is the safe harbor deadline established by law. That is the date by which the states have to know who their electors are going to be. In other words, they have to have had the votes counted so that they know whether they're sending Biden electors or Trump electors to the Electoral College on December 14th. So no matter how many times Donald Trump tries to cut off voting before the December 8th deadline, December 8th is the safe harbor deadline. I know that for me, I intend to have an advent calendar where one day I open it and it's like a coffee liqueur truffle. And the next day I open it and it's a GOP lawsuit to stop ballot counting. And the next day I open it and it's a bunch of mail-in ballots that are being discounted for having a red pen instead of a blue pen. And then maybe a mint truffle. That'll be my advent calendar.
And also throw December 14th in there as well, because we hope it doesn't get to that. But again, so that our viewers who maybe didn't watch that second episode can know, there is I know you all did, but go back and watch it in case you didn't. December 14th, there's a possibility that the Trump administration has caused so much chaos and so much confusion that in certain states, particularly swing states, he will convince GOP legislatures to send a fraudulent set of electors to cast their votes. And that could result in Congress having to decide between competing electors. And so that's another date that's really important to see if there are going to be competing electors. And when I say competing, I mean one set of legitimate electors and one set of fraudulent electors. So it's important to keep that date in mind because it could, we hope not, but it could be pivotal in this election.
And yeah, if you really want to scare your relatives and friends and family over the dinner table, do go back and watch that episode where we break it all down for you, because not only were Alana and I younger and less experienced at doing this, and we probably had fewer wrinkles and gray hair, but we really broke it down in a way where you can know all the weird details of electoral count law that you might not get anywhere else if you just watch this one show. Make you ready to fight those dinner table fights. Okay, so speaking of dinner table fights, we're going to spend a little bit of time now for our last segment, covering an issue that ties together a lot of the themes that we've been talking about in the show, and a lot of the reasons why this election almost certainly will not be settled on election night. By now, we all know there's been an historic surge in mail-in ballots. Which, as we've said, take a long time to count, especially in those states that, for whatever ludicrous reason, don't start counting until election day. A lot of states are being more reasonable and beginning the count as they get the ballots, but there are some states, including Pennsylvania, that will not be counting those mail-in ballots when they get them. They're going to be waiting till election day to start counting. But there's another issue that's prolonging this timeline, and that's really pivotal. So think back to when Louis DeJoy was given control, the Trump donor was given control of the United States Postal Service. It falls this year to the United States Postal Service in large part to get all of those mail-in ballots delivered and counted in time to meet the deadlines set in every state. So in normal times, with fewer mail-in ballots and no pandemic and a better resourced, more capable postal service that still had, letter sorting machines that had not been not only removed, but dismantled and destroyed by a potentially quite corrupt postmaster, this would be easier. In normal times, this would be we wouldn't be having this conversation over whether the mail could handle mail-in ballots. But under the current circumstances, there is a really real concern about whether these mail-in ballots will get where they need to go by the time they need to be there.
And this is particularly a concern, Emily, in swing states, because there was a recent study by the Washington Post that showed that some of the most erratic trends in mail behavior in mail service.
Mail behavior is a great phrase that actually may be more applicable here.
Mail behavior, let's do it. Okay. So the naughtiest mail behavior is happening in swing states.
Surprise.
Right? And so I'm going to point to a specific point in this report where they said in 17 postal districts representing 10 battleground states and 151 electoral votes, first-class mail is on time 83.9%. That's 7.8 percentage points lower than January and nearly 2 percentage points below the national average. By that measure, more than 1 in 6 mailings arrive outside the agency's 1 to 3 day delivery window. Now, because most states require mail-in or absentee ballots to be received by election day, this sets up a scenario where legitimate ballots postmarked at the correct date could be thrown out. And by the way, this is after voters do everything they can, cross every T, dot every I, get their mail into the mailbox the time that it needs to be there.
Envelope. Yeah.
And it's all really due to postal service delays, which, by the way, have nothing to do with the voter and all to do with voter suppression.
So to begin with, if you have a mail-in ballot and you are planning to mail it in, not drop it off, nothing's stopping you from mailing it today. I think that this would be the year to start early on mailing in your ballot, because there have been a string of lawsuits across the country, basically fighting over what the rules are about when the ballot has to be received. Which, I mean, this entire area of subject matter we're talking about is gross, because we're talking about delivery delays, not voters failing to get their ballot in on time. Voters who filled out their ballot and sent it in before election day. Voters who did everything right and who were failed by a United States Postal Service that has had the legs cut out from under it. So you may have seen headlines about the most prominent of these lawsuits. There was one that made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, Pennsylvania, Republican lawyers have been fighting to throw out any ballots received after Election Day, regardless of the postmark date. In other words, if you sent your ballot in 10 days before the election and the Postal Service lost it and left it in the back of a bag, or didn't have the mail sorting equipment that they needed in order to deliver your ballot, and they delivered it the day after the election, sorry, you don't get your vote counted. It might not be your fault, but we're silencing you anyway. So Pennsylvania State Supreme Court weighed in, ruling that officials had a grace period. Basically, they could count mail-in ballots received up to 3 days after Election Day, even if the postmark couldn't be read or was, absent for whatever reason. Now, the Supreme Court considered that ruling and deadlocked 4-4 in a decision earlier this week. If you follow Supreme Court rulings, you know that when the Supreme Court deadlocks 4-4, it lets the lower court ruling stand. So the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's decision that there was this grace period 3 days after the election is the rule we're going with. But there's something really notable about this Supreme Court ruling. The reason it was a 4-4 split was because Chief Justice Roberts sided with the liberals against Justices Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, Alito, and Thomas. In this moment, when we are also in the middle of an historic Supreme Court confirmation.
And it makes it so clear why the Republicans right now are trying to ram through this confirmation. Because if they do, and if they were to have done that, a result like this would have been completely different. I mean, think about it. Right now, Roberts isn't a liberal. And right now, we already have a conservative court that's going to be more conservative once Amy Coney Barrett is on it to be deciding elections. And will Roberts, in future scenarios, have the courage to be able to side with the liberals when he's always been a little bit more conservative? I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, what's really frightening to me here is this is not a tough call. We are a nation that puts itself forward as a representative form of government, right? And we are a nation that ostensibly believes in everybody who jumps through all these hoops that they need to jump through to vote should get to have their vote counted. And the only question here was whether it was proper to in this historic year, to allow a state to interpret its own state constitution and its own law in a way that allowed an extra 3 days. In other words, this is a state making a decision about its state constitution and state procedures. It is really disturbing that 4 members of the Supreme Court, and likely a 5th if Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed, would have said that the state of Pennsylvania does not have the right to self-governance in this manner. I mean, this has implications far beyond this case. It also shows you how kind of unhinged from the calling balls and strikes model of judging these members of the court are. We are no longer in a world where we are relying on the court to be apolitical. And I think anyone who's still thinking of the court as an apolitical body is really deluding themselves at this point.
Yeah. And something we've talked a lot about on this show is the need for Democrats to have more of a backbone. And I'm going to go on a slight tangent here that goes along with that theme, but I think it's an important tangent to go on. If we're looking at a Biden presidency, which we don't know we are, but if we are, his administration should really be thinking about the long-term impacts that this Supreme Court will have on future generations. That's going to far outlast that administration. That's going to far outlast Trump. And think about what they're going to do in order to correct that imbalance. And they shouldn't be scared to do that, and shouldn't be scared to take away all the norms of civility that the Republicans have ignored for so many years. And I'm going to not go too into that because somebody will be here tomorrow to do just that.
Special guest. Y'all, we have Leah Littman from the Strict Scrutiny podcast joining us tomorrow. So yeah, you can tell that Alana and I, both lawyers, real eager to do a deep dive right now. We are going to restrain ourselves. We're going to pull it back to mail-in voting and the subject matter at hand and just tell you, please tune in tomorrow because Leah Lippman is always really fun to talk to, and this subject is really interesting. And so you're going to have 3 excited, interested women talking about something groundbreaking. So tomorrow at 4:00. Anyway, back to other states. Alana, are other states going to follow Pennsylvania in giving grace periods like this?
No. No is the short answer. The long answer is that some states will be even more forgiving, which is nice, like Minnesota, in light of a recent ruling allowing the counting of absentee ballots up to 7 days after Election Day. But let's talk a little bit about Michigan. In Michigan, all ballots have to be received by a local clerk's office by 8 p.m. on Election Day. And this is following a state appeals court decision reimposing the cutoff date. And there was a previous lower court ruling that had said that ballots could be counted if they were postmarked before Election Day and received within 14 days. But of course, Republicans, as they do, fought this decision and won. And Emily, this is going to have big implications in Detroit, where only 7.9% of first-class mail was on time the week that ended October 9th, compared with 92.2% at the start of the year.
Right. You said 7%. I think you meant 70%.
Oh, 70.9%.
The 7% we're getting to like mail on the moon levels.
Right. 70.9% of first-class mail versus 92.2% at the start of the year. And there are specifically concerns in Detroit's suburbs where there have been mail carriers who have told the Post that they receive messages daily telling them to prioritize packages over other items, including, get this, election mail.
You know, that was actually the thing I noticed during the whole conversation about the Postal Service being forced to not just dismantle, but irreparably destroy mail sorting machines. I found it really notable that package sorting machines were not being destroyed. So you're really, I mean, dropping from, over 90% on-time delivery to barely 70% on-time delivery in a city where the mail carriers are saying they're being told to put Amazon before our democracy, is something that we should all be like profoundly freaked out about, especially in a state as important as Michigan. Moving next door to Wisconsin, a federal appeals court, of course, blocked a decision to extend the deadline for counting absentee ballots by 6 days, which was another win for Republicans in court. Democrats have asked the U.S. Supreme Court to take up the case, and they've argued that unique challenges this year, pandemic, Postal Service problems, are making it necessary for states to extend these windows. But I think we have real concerns, which we're going to talk about tomorrow, about like what happens if the Supreme Court takes up the case with a new Justice Barrett on the bench, who may not be as ready as Justice Roberts to do the right thing.
And I think we have to think about, again, what that means for this country and specifically like why, again, this confirmation is being rushed through, which I won't go there too hard again, but but I think we know that it all goes back to this Republican playbook of doing everything they possibly can to discount as many votes as possible, using courts, using voter suppression tactics, using narratives of what it means for what mail slowdowns mean for this election. So it's not incredibly surprising to me. And this difference here is not surprising to me, where you have Democrats who want to make it easier to partake in democracy, who want people's votes to count, don't want them to be discontrol or minor technicalities. And in this specific case, where we already know that we're not likely to get final results on election night, a few days really matter in terms of counting every vote.
Yeah. I mean, I want to just pick up on one thing. We're basically at the end of our show. But we can't end the show without talking about this. Mail carriers know their districts. They know their routes. They know the community they serve. And we're in a world where we've got very specific mail slowdowns that are based on political affiliation and really based on race. You've got mail carriers who are revealing that in Detroit, where we just talked about, dramatic drops in the reliability of service in Black neighborhoods, we're being told that the facilities that serve Detroit's white suburbs have remained pretty much unchanged. And I think that, in Florida, when we're talking about, South Florida, areas that are more heavily Democratic than the rest of the state, there's some of the worst mail service in the country happening there right now. This isn't, everybody's not dealing with the same struggles. When Steve Bannon stands up there, like he did, and we showed the clip of him saying like, well, sure, you can get your vote counted if you jump through all these hoops because you're the one who chose not to go to the polling place. The hoops aren't the same for everyone. If you're Black and living in Detroit, there are 400 hoops and they are all on fire. If you are white and living in a small town, in an affluent suburb, perhaps even in the same region, there might not even be 2 hoops and none of them are on fire. I mean, it's just not the same. It is not fair. It is not equally applied, and it is anti-democratic. Alana, say something reasonable before we end on me ranting.
No way. That was so good. I'm letting you end on that.
Well, in that case, then, that has been our show. I hope you will join us for more ranting, more information, a really fun conversation tomorrow with Leah Littman. 4 o'clock, same place. This has been another episode of The Count. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. This is Alana Sivan, and we will see you tomorrow.